Learn English through story. Sins and secrets. The rain came down in thick, relentless sheets, drowning the streets of Hollow's End in a murky glow. The town, nestled between dense forests and towering cliffs, had always carried an air of secrecy, as if the very land conspired to keep its sins buried. On nights like this, when the sky seemed to weep for the wicked, the ghosts of past wrongs whispered through the alleys, slipping into locked doors and tightly shut windows. Isla Hawthorne sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the flickering candlelight. The small inn where she had taken refuge smelled of damp wood and old regrets. She ran her fingers over the worn leather bound journal resting on her lap, the last remnant of a life she had abandoned. Within its pages lay the truth, though she had spent years perfecting the art of deception. But the weight of it pressed against her like a noose, tightening with each passing day. She had once been the darling of Hollow's End, the girl with sharp wit and sharper ambition. But that was before the scandal, before the whispers in the streets had turned to accusations, before the man she loved had been found dead in the river with her name on his lips. Now, years later, she had returned, drawn back by forces she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the unfinished business of a sin that refused to stay buried. Whatever it was, Isla knew she wouldn't leave this time without facing the truth. The door creaked open and a shadow slithered inside. Isla didn't flinch. She had been expecting him. "You shouldn't have come back," the man said, his voice low and sharp as a knife. Isla met his gaze. "And yet, here I am." Nathaniel Graves stood before her, his face carved from stone, his eyes dark with something between anger and longing. They had once been inseparable before the lies, before the betrayal. He had been her closest friend, her fiercest protector. Now, he was the gatekeeper to the secrets she had tried so hard to outrun. "What do you want, Isla?" he asked. She tightened her grip on the journal. "The truth." Nathaniel let out a bitter laugh. "The truth is dangerous in Hollow's End. It has a way of swallowing people whole." "I'm not afraid of the truth," she said. His expression darkened. "Then you should be afraid of what it will cost you." The storm outside howled as if in warning, and in that moment, Isla knew some sins refused to stay buried, and some secrets had the power to destroy them all. The candlelight wavered as a gust of wind crept through the cracks in the window, casting long shadows across the walls. Isla kept her gaze steady on Nathaniel, though the weight of his presence pressed against her like a force she hadn't yet learned how to withstand. Time had sharpened him. His once boyish features were now carved with the hardness of experience, his shoulders broader, his stance unyielding. He looked at her like a man who had learned too well the price of misplaced trust. She swallowed. "You never answered my letters." Nathaniel scoffed, his jaw tightening. "And yet you still came back. You should have taken the silence for what it was." His words stung more than she had expected, though she had no right to be wounded by them. She had left without a word, vanishing into the world beyond Hollow's End, leaving behind only questions and a body in the river. And now she was here, demanding answers as though she weren't part of the ruin she had left in her wake. Isla exhaled slowly, gripping the journal tighter. "You were my friend once. You were mine too." Nathaniel shot back, his voice quieter now, edged with something more dangerous than anger-pain. "But friends don't disappear in the night and leave others to answer for their sins. A lump formed in Isla's throat. She had known this wouldn't be easy, that standing before Nathaniel, feeling the cold distance between them, made her realize just how much of her past had unraveled without her. "I had no choice," she whispered. Nathaniel's expression darkened. "You always had a choice." She flinched. If only he knew the truth. If only he understood the secret she had carried all these years. The one that had forced her hand. The one that had turned her into a fugitive in her own home. Silence thickened between them, filled with words neither was willing to say. Finally, Nathaniel took a step back, running a hand through his damp hair. "You shouldn't have come back, Isla. People here haven't forgotten. Some haven't forgiven." A chill crawled down her spine. She had expected resentment, but there was something in his voice that suggested more than just lingering anger. It was a warning. "Who hasn't forgiven?" she asked carefully. Nathaniel hesitated, then sighed. "Edwin Langley." The name sent ice through her veins. Of course. Edwin had always been the man in the shadows, pulling the strings of Hollow's End with quiet cruelty. He had been the first to call for her punishment. When her name had been tied to the scandal, she forced herself to stand. "Does he know I'm back?" Nathaniel's gaze flickered to the window, where the rain still lashed against the glass. "He will soon enough." A shiver of unease slithered through her. Edwin Langley was not a man to forget a slight, and Isla's return was more than just an unwelcome visit. It was a challenge to the power he had so carefully maintained. She turned back to Nathaniel, desperation creeping into her voice. "Then I don't have much time." His eyes narrowed. "For what?" She hesitated before answering. "To prove I didn't kill him." Nathaniel stilled. A long, tense moment passed before he spoke. "Then you've come back for nothing," he said, his voice almost sorrowful. "Because everyone already knows who killed him." Her breath caught. "Who?" Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "You, Isla." The room seemed to shrink around her, the air growing thick with an invisible force. For years, she had known the town had condemned her in her absence, but hearing it from Nathaniel made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "They're wrong," she whispered. Nathaniel searched her face, something flickering behind his guarded expression. Doubt? Hope? She couldn't tell. But before he could respond, a sound outside caught both of their attention low. Deliberate knock on the door. Isla's heart pounded. Nathaniel's eyes darkened. "You were followed." She barely had time to react before the door burst open, and the past came crashing in all at once. The door slammed open, the wind howling in behind the intruder. A tall figure stepped into the dimly lit room, his coat dripping rain onto the wooden floor. Isla's breath hitched as her eyes adjusted to the new presence. Edwin Langley. Even after all these years, he hadn't changed. His gaunt face remained sharp, his eyes cold and calculating, like a man who enjoyed watching others squirm beneath his gaze. He carried the scent of damp earth and old leather, and when he smiled, it wasn't with warmth. It was the grin of a predator toying with his prey. "I thought I heard whispers of your return," he mused, shutting the door behind him with eerie calmness. His voice was smooth, almost pleasant, but there was venom beneath it. "I didn't believe it at first. I thought surely you'd have enough sense to stay gone." Isla swallowed the lump in her throat, keeping her back straight. She wouldn't cower, not in front of him. "I had to come back." Edwin raised an eyebrow. "Had to?" He took a step closer. Or did you finally grow tired of running? Nathaniel moved then, stepping between them, his posture rigid. She's not alone, Langy. Edwin chuckled, shaking the rain from his sleeves. Oh, I know. His gaze flicked toward the journal in Isla's hands, and his expression shifted mild amusement, giving way to something more calculating. Is that what you came back for? Isla clutched the book tighter. It's none of your concern. But you see, everything about you is my concern. Edwin's voice lowered, the weight of his words settling in the air like a noose. You didn't just leave a stain on this town. When you ran, you left a wound. And some wounds don't heal. I didn't kill him, Isla said, the words sharper than she intended. Edwin's lips curled into a smirk. You keep saying that. But you see, Isla, the truth is never about what really happened. It's about what people believe. He stepped closer, so close she could smell the bitter tang of whiskey on his breath. And they believe you drowned him. A storm churned inside Isla's chest, anger rising beneath her skin. Because you made them believe it. Edwin's smirk didn't waver. People need a villain. You fit the role nicely. Nathaniel's fists clenched at his sides. You always needed someone to blame, didn't you? Edwin didn't even acknowledge him. His eyes remained locked onto Isla's, searching, testing. So tell me, darling, what do you think you'll find in that little book of yours? A miracle? Redemption? He tilted his head. Or maybe another secret worth burying. Isla's fingers dug into the leather cover. She had spent years running from the past, but she had never truly been free of it. And now, standing before the man who had orchestrated her downfall, she realized the truth had never been about proving her innocence. It had always been about exposing the real darkness hiding in Hollow's End. Edwin studied her for another moment before chuckling under his breath. You've made a mistake coming back here, Isla. No, she said, voice steady. My mistake was ever leaving. For the first time, something flickered in Edwin's eyes just for a moment. But then he smiled again, shaking his head. Suit yourself. He turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping out into the storm. But I'd keep an eye out if I were you. Accidents have a nasty way of finding people who dig too deep. And with that, he was gone. The silence he left behind was thick and suffocating. The candlelight flickered as the wind snuck through the cracks in the walls. Isla let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Nathaniel exhaled sharply. You're playing a dangerous game. Isla turned to him, her grip still firm on the journal. Then I suppose it's time I start winning. He studied her, his expression unreadable. And then, without another word, he reached for his coat. Where are you going? She asked. Nathaniel's jaw was tight. To find out just how much of this town is still worth saving. Then he was gone too, leaving Isla alone with the storm, the journal, and the sins she had come back to unravel. The inn felt hollow in Nathaniel's absence, the silence pressing against Isla like an unseen force. She remained still for a moment, gripping the journal as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. The rain outside had softened to a quiet drizzle, but the tension in her chest remained. She turned her attention to the journal, fingers brushing over the worn leather. Every secret she had tried to bury was inside these pages. Every truth she had once feared. If she was going to prove her innocence, she had to start here. She sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through the pages, her breath hitching as she reached. The last entry the night before she had fled. Hollow's End. The ink was smudged from her shaking hand. The words frantic. I hear them outside. They know. They know about us. I don't know if I can trust him. He said he would take care of it. But I see the fear in his eyes. If something happens to me, I pray someone finds this. The truth is here. Isla swallowed hard. The words struck her like a blade sharp, unrelenting. She had written this in terror. The memory came rushing back with brutal clarity, the shadows moving outside her window, the hurried whispers in the dark, the overwhelming dread that had sent her running. But now, reading these words, one thing stood out. Asterisk. He said he would take care of it. Who was she talking about? She tried to remember, but the night was a haze of fear and confusion. Had she meant Nathaniel? Someone else? A sudden knock at the door made her jump. Her pulse quickened as she moved toward it. The storm outside had driven most people indoors, and Nathaniel had already left. So who would come looking for her now? She hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding. A woman stood in the doorway, cloaked in deep red, her dark hair damp from the rain. Her face was older than Isla remembered, lined with exhaustion, but her eyes still carried the sharpness of a woman who had learned to survive. Lillian, Isla breathed. Lillian Vale, her former friend, her once ally. The only other person who had known the full extent of what had happened that night. Lillian's lips pressed into a tight line. You need to leave. Isla frowned. What? You shouldn't have come back, Isla. Lillian's voice was strained, as if the words themselves hurt. They won't let you walk away twice. Isla stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. But Lillian hesitated. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be watching, the force slipping inside quickly. She pulled the hood of her cloak down, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. Her eyes darted to the journal in Isla's hands, and her expression darkened. They know you have it, Lillian said. Isla's grip tightened. What do you mean? Lillian inhaled sharply. Edwin isn't the only one who wants to keep the past buried. There are others, people who were involved. People who need you gone. A cold weight settled in Isla's chest. Lillian took a step closer, lowering her voice. You don't understand. Isla, this isn't just about proving your innocence anymore. It's about surviving long enough to tell the truth. A chill crawled down Isla's spine. She had come back for justice. She hadn't realized she might die for it. The room felt smaller with Lillian inside it, the air thick with unspoken words. The candle between them flickered as the wind howled outside, rattling the window pane. Isla could see the fear in Lillian's eyes, the urgency in her stance. She wasn't just warning her, she was pleading. Who else knows I'm here? Isla asked, keeping her voice low. Lillian hesitated. Too many. She ran a hand through her damp hair, frustration seeping into her tone. When Edwin heard you were back, he didn't just sit on it. He's been talking to people who have no problem making sure this stays buried. Isla swallowed. Who? Lillian's eyes flickered with something unreadable. The ones who helped him cover it up in the first place. The weight of the words settled deep in Isla's chest. She had always known that Edwin was the puppet master in Hollow's End, but the idea that others had been complicit in the lies, in framing her for a crime she didn't commit, it made her stomach turn. You have to leave, Lillian insisted, gripping her wrist. You don't understand what kind of people you're dealing with. Isla yanked her arm free, shaking her head. No. Lillian blinked. Isla, I didn't come back just to run away again. Isla's voice was firm, her fingers tightening around the journal. I came back for answers. For justice. Lillian let out a bitter laugh. Justice? In this town? She shook her head. You're still the same girl, aren't you? Still thinking the truth is enough to fix things. Isla's jaw clenched. If I can prove I wasn't the one who killed him, then what? Lillian cut in, stepping closer, her voice sharp. Do you think that will suddenly make everything right? That people will apologize? That the ones who set you up will just step forward and confess? Silence hung between them. Lillian exhaled slowly, her tone softening. You're putting yourself in danger for a past that doesn't want to be uncovered. Isla looked down at the journal in her hands. The words inside were the last trace of the person she had once been, of the nightmare she had tried to outrun. But if she didn't see this through, if she left again, then the truth would stay buried forever. She met Lillian's gaze. Then help me. Lillian went rigid. You were there that night, Isla continued. You know more than you've ever said. Lillian's lips parted, but no words came. A beat of silence passed before she looked away, her hands trembling as she pulled her cloak tighter around herself. You don't want to know the truth, Isla? Yes, Isla whispered. I do. Lillian's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Isla saw something else in her guilt. A knock at the door made both women freeze. Lillian's breath hitched. You have to hide. Isla shook her head. No. The knock came again, harder this time. Lillian swore under her breath, grabbing Isla's wrist. You don't get it. If they find you here, you're as good as dead. That Isla was done hiding. She was done running. Heart pounding, she moved to the door and opened it. The man standing outside was not one she had expected to see. Edwin Langley's right-hand man, Victor Harley. He was taller than she remembered, his presence filling the doorway, his face a mask of indifference. His coat was damp from the rain, his sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a voice like a blade, he said, Mr. Langley would like a word. A chill crept down Isla's spine. Lillian's hand closed into a fist at her side. She's not going anywhere. Victor ignored her, his gaze never leaving Isla's. I wasn't asking. The unspoken threat lingered between them. Isla took a slow breath. Then, without breaking eye contact, she said, Tell him if he wants to speak to me. He can come himself. Victor studied her for a moment before letting out a low chuckle. You've changed. Isla tilted her chin up. Not enough. Victor's smirk faded. That's a shame. He stepped back into the storm, adjusting his coat. I'd be careful if I were you, Isla. He nodded toward the journal in her hands. Some stories aren't meant to be told. And with that, he disappeared into the night. Isla shut the door, pulse hammering. Lillian exhaled sharply. You really don't know when to stop, do you? No, Isla murmured, looking down at the journal. And for the first time, she knew she was getting close to something. Something dangerous. Something deadly. But she wasn't stopping now. Not until she uncovered the truth. Not until the real sinners paid for their secrets. The fire in the hearth crackled, its glow casting flickering shadows across the room. Lillian paced near the window, occasionally peering through the rain-streaked glass, as if expecting trouble to arrive at any moment. You should leave before it's too late, she muttered, voice tight with urgency. Isla ignored her, settling onto the wooden chair by the desk, Her hands trembled as she opened the journal once more, her eyes scanning the frantic scrawl of her past self. Asterisk. He said he would take care of it. Who had she meant? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force her memory past the haze of fear and adrenaline that had clouded that night. Nathaniel? No. He had been her closest friend. He wouldn't have betrayed her. Lillian? Doubtful. Whatever she was hiding, she seemed more afraid of the truth than of Isla herself. A shiver ran down her spine. What if it had been someone she had never suspected? Lillian's pacing stopped abruptly. What exactly do you think you're going to find in there? She asked, arms folded tightly. The truth, Isla murmured, still flipping through the pages. Lillian let out a humorless laugh. The truth got someone killed. Isla froze, lifting her gaze. What did you just say? Lillian's expression shuttered. She turned away, shaking her head. Lillian. Isla's voice was sharp now. Who was killed? Lillian sighed, rubbing her temple. You need to stop digging. Isla pushed back from the desk, standing. No. You just confirmed it someone else died that night, didn't they? Lillian hesitated. Then, finally, she exhaled in resignation. You only ever heard about one body in the river. Her voice was quiet, but there were two. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Isla. What? She breathed. Lillian's jaw clenched. I'm telling you this because you need to understand. You think you're here to clear your name, but you don't see the full picture. The night you ran, someone else died. She turned back to face Isla, her expression grim. And that's the death Edwin really wants buried. A sickening realization settled in Isla's chest. She had spent years believing that she was running from one crime, the murder she had been blamed for. But now, for the first time, she considered something far worse. She had been running from a crime she didn't even know had happened. The room felt colder despite the fire still burning in the hearth. Isla stared at Lillian, her pulse roaring in her ears. Two bodies. All these years, she had believed she had been running from a single crime, the murder of James Thornton, the man whose death she had been accused of. But now Lillian was telling her that someone else had died that night. And she had never known. Her fingers tightened around the journal. Who? Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Lillian didn't answer immediately. She crossed the room, her movements restless, uncertain. Then, finally, she exhaled and met Isla's gaze. Carolyn Thornton. Isla's breath hitched. James's sister? Lillian nodded grimly. They kept her death a secret. The room spun. Carolyn Thornton had been a quiet, delicate girl, never one to get involved in the town's power struggles, always lingering on the edges of the chaos that her brother had created. Isla remembered her as someone who barely spoke above a murmur, someone who seemed like she didn't belong in Hollow's End at all. And now Lillian was telling her she had died that night. How? Isla demanded, her voice sharp. How did she die? Lillian hesitated. She drowned. Isla flinched, the same way they had said James had died. Why wasn't this ever brought up? Lillian let out a bitter laugh. Because they needed a scapegoat for James's death. A second body would have complicated the story. Isla's stomach churned. She had been framed for murder. But what if the real secret wasn't just about who killed James? What if the bigger question was, why did Carolyn die? She took an unsteady step back. Are you telling me that they covered up an entire murder? That an entire town agreed to pretend she never existed? Lillian's expression was tight. They didn't need the whole town to agree. Just the right people. Edwin Langley, Nathaniel's father, Mayor Reed, Victor Harley. People who controlled the flow of information. The whispers in the streets. What did Carolyn know? Isla murmured. Lillian's jaw clenched. Enough to get herself killed. A knock at the door sent a jolt through both women. They locked eyes. Lillian moved first, grabbing Isla's arm and dragging her toward the back of the room. We can't answer it. But Isla had had enough of running. She pulled free from Lillian's grip and strode to the door, heart pounding. Without hesitation, she yanked it open. Nathaniel stood on the other side, rain dripping from his coat. His face was shadowed, unreadable. We need to talk. His voice was tight, urgent. Isla swallowed hard, stepping aside. Nathaniel entered, shaking off the rain. His sharp gaze flicked between Isla and Lillian, before settling on the journal in Isla's hands. You found something. It wasn't a question. Isla held his gaze. Carolyn. Nathaniel went still. His fingers curled at his sides, his jaw tightening. Lillian crossed her arms. So, you knew. Nathaniel's eyes darkened. I suspected. Isla stepped closer. Why didn't you ever tell me? His expression wavered for the first time. Because I didn't want to believe it was true. He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his damp hair. And because if you knew, they never would have let you leave Hollow's End alive. A chill ran through Isla. She had always thought she was running from a lie. Now she realized she had been running from the truth. And the truth had always been more dangerous. Nathaniel met her gaze, his voice low. Isla, if you start pulling at this thread, you won't be able to stop. And neither will they. She straightened, gripping the journal. Then I guess it's time we tear the whole thing apart. Nathaniel's words echoed in Isla's mind as she stepped back from him, her heart racing with a mix of fear and resolve. He was right in one way once she started pulling at this thread. There would be no turning back. But how could she stop now? The truth was so close, so painfully close. And now it wasn't just her life on the line. It was Caroline's. And possibly more people who had been silenced over the years. Lillian stood at the window again, her eyes trained on the storm outside, her arms crossed tight. She didn't speak, but the tension in the room was palpable. She didn't have to say anything. Her silence was enough. I know what you're thinking, Isla, Nathaniel said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. But this isn't just about you. It's bigger than that. You'll tear apart the entire town if you expose what really happened. Isla's chest tightened. Then I'll tear it apart. Because the truth matters more than the town's comfort. She lifted her chin, determination hardening her resolve. If people are going to die for the truth, then I need to make sure it gets out. I owe it to Carolyn, to everyone who has been buried under lies. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. You don't owe anyone anything, Isla. This town, this place doesn't care about justice. They only care about power and keeping their hands clean. His eyes softened as he looked at her, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of the man she had once known. I've already lost too much trying to expose what's happened here. I don't want you to be another victim. Isla shook her head. I've already been a victim, Nathaniel. And I'm done running. For a moment, Nathaniel looked at her with a mixture of frustration and fear. Then he sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. You're right, he said softly. You have every right to know the truth. But if we're going to do this, we have to be careful. There are people in this town who won't hesitate to bury you. Just like they buried Carolyn. Lillian finally turned around, her eyes cold. And they'll do worse than bury you if you keep pushing. If you want to survive this, Isla, you need to get out. Now, before they come for you. Isla shook her head, her resolve hardening with every passing second. I won't run again. Not this time. There was a long silence, heavy with the weight of their unspoken words. Finally, Nathaniel spoke again. Then you'll need my help. His voice was flat, resigned. But don't think it will be easy. I've been part of this town's web for years. You can't just tear it down without consequences. Isla's eyes met his. I'm not afraid of the consequences anymore. A moment of silence passed between them before Nathaniel nodded slowly. All right, he said. His voice a mix of acceptance and something else regret. But we do it my way. No more surprises. We need to be smart about this. Lillian snorted, a bitter smile curving her lips. Smart? You think you can outsmart them? I've seen how they play. She walked to the door, throwing a glance over her shoulder. Just don't say I didn't warn you both when it all goes to hell. With that, she left, leaving Isla and Nathaniel alone in the room. The weight of what was coming pressing down on them both. Nathaniel turned to face Isla, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. We need to find out exactly how Carolyn died. We know she was in the river, but if we're going to prove what happened, we need more than that. I have some contacts who might know more about what happened that night. But it's risky. They've been quiet for years, but if they talk, it could mean trouble for all of us. Isla nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the risks. She had known them from the start, but it was too late to back out now. She had to know. She had to uncover what had really happened to Carolyn Thornton and to herself. I don't care about the risk, Isla said, her voice steady. We do whatever it takes to get the truth. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but stay close. Don't trust anyone outside of the few people we know we can rely on. They're watching you, Isla. A shiver ran down her spine at his words. Who's watching? Nathaniel's face hardened. Edwin's men. Victor Harley, for one. Isla swallowed hard. She had known Victor was dangerous, but hearing Nathaniel speak of him like this made her skin crawl. We'll need to move carefully. Nathaniel continued, his voice low. I'll start reaching out to my contacts. In the meantime, you should stay out of sight. Isla felt a surge of anger. I'm not hiding. Not again. Nathaniel met her gaze, his eyes filled with something desperation, maybe. You don't understand what they'll do to you, Isla. They'll make sure you never speak again. And I can't protect you from that. The intensity of his words struck Isla, and for the first time since she'd returned to Hollow's End, doubt crept into her mind. But she shook it off. She had already made her choice. I'll take my chances, she said, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. I won't let them bury me, Nathaniel. The rain outside had intensified, slashing against the windows like angry fingers. The room felt small and suffocating as Isla stood there, her mind racing with everything she had just learned. Nathaniel was right about one thing: they couldn't take another misstep. That every part of her screamed for action, for confrontation. She had been running from the truth for too long, and now it was time to face it head on, no matter the cost. Nathaniel's gaze never left her as she stood, her back straight and defiant. "You're stubborn," he said quietly, a wry smile tugging at his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just like you always were. I didn't come back to play safe," she replied firmly. "I came back for the truth. I'm not backing down." Nathaniel sighed, running a hand over his face. "Fine, then we need to go. We can't waste any more time." Isla nodded, clutching the journal tightly in her hands. The weight of it seemed heavier than it had ever been before. Every page, every word was like a thread unraveling in her mind, leading her closer to something dark, something far bigger than she had ever imagined. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice steady. Nathaniel's expression turned serious. "We need to speak to someone who was there that night. Someone who knew Carolyn personally. Someone who might have seen something, even if they didn't realize its significance." Isla raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "There's a woman named Margaret Lawson. She's lived in Hollow's End her entire life. She's seen things most people don't even know about. And she's not afraid to speak her mind." Nathaniel paused, his tone growing more cautious. "But you have to understand Margaret isn't exactly the most trustworthy person. She's unpredictable." Isla looked at him skeptically. "Unpredictable how?" Nathaniel hesitated before answering. "She's been a recluse for years. Doesn't trust anyone. And she's been known to twist the truth to suit her own interests." Isla narrowed her eyes. "So she's a risk?" "A big one," Nathaniel admitted. "But right now, she's our best shot at getting answers." Isla considered this, the weight of the decision hanging heavily on her. But she couldn't back down now. Not when she was so close. "Let's go then," she said firmly. And Nathaniel nodded, heading for the door. The wind howled through the streets of Hollow's End. As they made their way through the town, the shadows of the night swallowing them whole, Isla kept her eyes sharp, aware of every movement, every sound. She didn't trust this town, never had. They reached Margaret's house at the edge of town, a dilapidated cottage that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. It was clear that no one had lived here in a long time. Nathaniel knocked on the door 3 times, each knock louder than the last. There was a long pause before the sound of heavy footsteps approached from the inside. The door creaked open, revealing a woman who seemed older than Isla had imagined. Her hair was a mass of tangled grey, her face etched with deep lines, and her eyes were dark and piercing, studying them both with an intensity that made Isla uneasy. "What do you want?" Margaret's voice was raspy, filled with suspicion. "We need to talk," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "About Carolyn Thornton." Margaret's eyes flickered with something recognition. Maybe fear, but it was gone so quickly that Isla wasn't sure she had seen it. The woman leaned against the doorframe, her arms folded. "Carolyn Thornton, you say?" Margaret's voice was low, almost mocking. "What makes you think I know anything about that girl?" Nathaniel didn't flinch. "Because you were there that night. You were there when she died." Margaret's expression darkened, her lips tightening. "You know nothing about me. And you know even less about that night." She stepped back, clearly about to shut the door. Nathaniel's hand shot out, blocking the door from closing. "Margaret, we know more than you think. And if you want to keep your secrets buried, you need to start talking." For a moment there was silence. Then finally, Margaret let out a low, bitter laugh. "You think I'm afraid of you? You don't know a damn thing about fear." Isla stepped forward, her voice steady and calm. We don't want to fight with you, Margaret. We just need the truth. We need to know what happened that night. Carolyn is dead. And if you know anything that could explain how, now's the time to tell us. Margaret's gaze flicked between the two of them, a long pause stretching out before she spoke again. You think you're going to find the truth in this godforsaken place? You think digging into the past is going to set things right? She sneered, her hands shaking as she gripped the doorframe. The truth is a weapon, and it's not one you want to wield. Isla's heart pounded as she stepped closer, refusing to back down. I'm not afraid of the truth, Margaret. I just need you to help me understand it. Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she didn't move to shut the door. You want to know what happened that night? She leaned closer, lowering her voice. You'd be better off leaving it buried. Nathaniel placed a hand on Isla's arm, signaling her to hold back. But Isla wasn't going to be deterred now. Margaret stared at them both for a long, tense moment before she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. If you want to know about that night, you'll have to pay the price. Isla's stomach churned. What price? Margaret smiled grimly. The price of knowing the truth is far more than you're willing to pay. But if you're determined, you'll find out soon enough. With that, she stepped back, slamming the door in their faces. Isla and Nathaniel stood in stunned silence for a moment. Then Nathaniel spoke, his voice tense. Get ready, Isla. Whatever this truth is, it's going to break everything wide open. Isla could feel it like a storm was about to hit, and they were right in its path. They had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The door slammed shut, echoing through the night like a warning. Isla stood frozen, staring at the dark wood, the weight of Margaret's words pressing down on her chest. The price of knowing the truth. What had she meant? Nathaniel's hand on her arm was firm, grounding her in the moment. His eyes were narrowed, his jaw clenched. She's hiding something. I can feel it. Isla took a deep breath, trying to steady her pulse. We need to know what she meant. We can't walk away now. Nathaniel nodded, looking around the overgrown yard. Margaret's not going to make this easy. But there's another way to get what we need. Isla turned toward him, confused. What do you mean? Nathaniel's eyes flickered with something. Dangerous an edge she hadn't seen in him before. There's another way to get Margaret to talk, but it's going to push us both to the limit. A chill ran down Isla's spine. What are you suggesting? Nathaniel hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. We break into her house. Find out what she's hiding. Isla stared at him, feeling the weight of his words. She had never done anything like that before, and the thought of breaking into someone's home was unsettling. But she could sense his desperation, the urgency in his voice. If Margaret wouldn't talk willingly, this might be their only option. Are you sure? Isla asked quietly. Nathaniel's eyes were intense. That there was something else in them, fear, maybe. Or was it just the weight of all the things they were about to do? We have no choice, he said, his voice low. She's the key to everything. If we don't do this, we'll be stuck in the dark, chasing shadows. Isla nodded, though doubt still gnawed at her. Let's do it then. They circled back around to the side of the house, moving quickly through the shadows. The wind howled in the distance, making the trees sway ominously. Isla's heart raced in her chest as she followed Nathaniel's lead, her eyes darting around, every sound amplifying in her ears. Nathaniel approached a small side window, hidden behind overgrown ivy. This is our best shot. The back door is locked up tight. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thin metal tool. I've done this before, he muttered. Isla swallowed hard, her stomach churning. She wasn't used to this breaking into someone's home, letting herself become part of the crime, even if the end goal was to uncover the truth. But she had already crossed too many lines to back away now. Nathaniel worked quickly, the faint sound of the metal clicking against the window frame making Isla's skin crawl. Finally, with a soft click, the window creaked open. Get in, he whispered, stepping aside to let her climb through first. Isla hesitated for just a moment, then took a deep breath and slipped into the darkened room. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay and mildew overpowering. As Nathaniel followed her inside, she could barely make out the shape of furniture in the shadows, the oppressive quiet of the house pressing in on her. Where do we start? Isla asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nathaniel scanned the room, his eyes sharp. Margaret's never been one for subtlety. She'll keep things in plain sight. We need to find a way to her desk or wherever she keeps her papers. They moved through the house, every creak of the floorboard sounding like a shout in the silence. Isla's heart thudded in her chest, the adrenaline heightening every sound, every movement. Finally, they reached the small study at the back of the house. The room was cluttered, papers stacked in haphazard piles, a thick layer of dust on the furniture. But there, in the corner, was a large wooden desk, its drawers slightly ajar. This is it, Nathaniel murmured. Isla stepped forward, reaching for the drawer closest to her. She pulled it open slowly, trying to keep the sound to a minimum, and her heart skipped when she saw what was inside. A stack of papers, old and yellowed with age. Several photographs. A small notebook, worn at the edges. Do you see this? Isla asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. She held up a photo of Caroline Young, innocent, smiling. But there was something off about the image. Something hidden beneath the surface. Nathaniel leaned in, his gaze narrowing. That's Caroline. But this photo looks like it was taken shortly before she... He paused, his voice thick with a mix of disbelief and dread. Before she died. Isla flipped through the papers quickly, her fingers trembling as they skimmed over names and dates. Some of the names were familiar people who had been close to the Thornton family. Others were strangers, their relevance unclear. Then, at the bottom of the stack, she found a letter. Its paper was old and yellowed, the ink smudged in places. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she read the words aloud. Asterisk. If you want the truth, you must come to the river. Midnight. It's the only place where the past can be forgiven. Isla's throat tightened as she finished reading. The letter was signed only with a symbole, crude drawing of a serpent coiled around a dagger. What the hell is this? Isla whispered, her voice thick with confusion. Nathaniel took the letter from her, his face pale. This was meant for Caroline, he muttered under his breath, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. Whoever wrote this knew something, knew what was going to happen. Isla's mind raced. But why didn't she tell anyone? Why didn't she go to the authorities? Nathaniel looked up, his eyes dark and filled with regret. Because whoever wrote this wasn't someone she could trust. And because... He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Because Caroline was trying to escape the truth. She didn't want anyone to know what she'd uncovered. Isla's heart pounded as she looked back at the letter, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. But it wasn't enough. They needed more. Isla stood in the dimly lit study, the letter still clutched in her trembling hands, its cryptic message echoing in her mind. Asterisk, if you want the truth, you must come to the river. Midnight. It's the only place where the past can be forgiven. Asterisk. The letter felt like a key to something far more sinister than she could have imagined. But there were so many questions. Who had written this letter? Why had Carolyn kept it hidden? And why had she gone to the river that night, just hours before she had been found dead? Nathaniel stood beside her, his expression unreadable as he stared down at the words, his fingers curling around the paper, as though he were trying to understand something buried beneath its surface. This letter, he murmured, his voice distant. This is why she went to the river. She knew something that got her killed. Isla's mind raced. But if she knew the truth, why didn't she say anything? Why didn't she tell anyone? Nathaniel's eyes flickered to the photos on the desk. Caroline's bright smile seemed so out of place now, like a mask hiding something darker. Carolyn wasn't a fool. She wasn't one to make waves unless she had no other choice. Whatever she found out, it was enough to make her scared. Too scared to trust anyone. Isla's stomach turned as she remembered the look in Margaret's eyes when they confronted her. That coldness, that bitterness. And Margaret knows more. She has to. She gave us this clue. But she's holding back. She's afraid of something. I can feel it. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. We can't trust her. She knows more than she's letting on. And she's not going to just hand it to us. Isla glanced around the room, feeling the weight of every shadow, every creak in the floorboards. What if Margaret's afraid because she's involved in all of this? What if she's hiding something worse than we think? Nathaniel's eyes flickered to the door. It's possible, but we need more evidence. This letter is a lead, but it's not enough to make any solid conclusions. We need to get to the river. The words hit Isla like a tidal wave. The river. It was where Caroline had gone before she was found dead. It was where everything had started, and now, it seemed, it was where everything would end. Tonight, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. We need to go to the river tonight. Nathaniel stared at her, his expression unreadable. It's dangerous, Isla. We don't even know what we're walking into. I don't care. We have to do this. Her voice was sharp, unwavering. She couldn't back down now. She wouldn't. He sighed, shaking his head. You're not going alone. Isla nodded, her resolve hardening. I wouldn't dream of it. The hours leading up to midnight felt like a lifetime. The house was still, too still. The weight of the decision, pressing on Isla's shoulders as she prepared for what lay ahead. Nathaniel was equally silent, lost in his thoughts, his eyes scanning every corner of the room as though he were waiting for something to jump out at him. The rain had stopped, but the sky was thick with clouds, casting everything in a muted, shadowed light. The air felt heavy with anticipation, charged with something they couldn't quite name. Isla grabbed her coat, her fingers brushing over the letter again as though it could offer more answers. The serpent coiled around the dagger. The symbolism was clear, now the past had been slashed open. And now they were about to delve into the heart of it. She looked at Nathaniel, who was already standing by the door, his face set. Ready? She asked. He gave a short nod. Let's go. They moved through the house in silence. careful not to make a sound. The town outside was quiet, too quiet, as though it were holding its breath. Every step they took seemed to reverberate in the stillness, and Isla could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed, but she wasn't afraid anymore. They reached the outskirts of town quickly, the winding road leading them down toward the river. The path was slick with mud, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. As they neared the water's edge, Isla felt a chill crawl up her spine. The river was wide and slow-moving, the surface dark and foreboding under the moonlight. There was something haunting about the way it stretched out before them, its waters carrying the secrets of the past and hiding them beneath its surface. Isla felt a pull toward it, an unexplainable force, as though the river itself were calling her. She had to know what happened that night. She had to know the truth. "Where do we start?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tight with tension. Isla scanned the riverbank, her eyes narrowing, as she looked for any sign of anything that would lead them to the answers they sought. Then, something caught her eye. A set of footprints, faded but still visible in the mud. She followed them with her eyes, her heart thudding in her chest. "There," she whispered, pointing. "We follow the tracks." Nathaniel nodded, and together they moved toward the trail, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The river's current roared in their ears as they stepped carefully along the muddy bank, the darkness around them thickening with each passing moment. The footprints led them to a clearing, a small, secluded spot where the trees opened up to reveal a large, flat rock jutting out over the water. And there, on the rock, was something that made Isla's blood run cold. A blood-stained scarf. Nathaniel's voice was barely a whisper as he crouched beside it, his hand hovering over the fabric. "This is Caroline's." Isla felt a lump form in her throat as she nodded. The evidence was clear now. Caroline had been here on this very spot. But what had happened? What had she found? Nathaniel turned to her, his face grim. "This is it. Whatever she uncovered, whatever she found that night, it happened here." Isla's eyes darted to the surrounding trees, her mind racing. But where did she go after this? What did she find? This is where the letter led us. But it doesn't explain everything. The wind howled again, and the sound of rushing water seemed to echo in Isla's ears, drowning out everything else. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her, suffocating her. But then something caught her eye, a faint shimmer in the distance. Just beyond the trees, a shape barely visible in the moonlight. "Look," she whispered, pointing toward the shadowed figure. Nathaniel's gaze followed hers, and his expression hardened. "Who is that?" They weren't alone anymore. The figure in the distance moved slowly, its silhouette a shadow against the dark canvas of the night. Isla's breath caught in her throat as she and Nathaniel exchanged a quick, knowing glance. Whoever it was, they had found someone who, perhaps, held the last thread of the unraveling mystery. "Should we approach?" Isla asked, her voice barely audible, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile tension of the moment. Nathaniel hesitated, his eyes never leaving the figure. He was torn between caution and the overwhelming need to uncover the truth. "We have no choice. But stay alert. Whoever this is, they know something. We need answers, not confrontation." They moved forward carefully, their footsteps soft against the muddy ground, as they followed the faint light from the distant figure. As they drew closer, The shape began to take form. A woman, standing still at the edge of the river, her back to them, her long coat billowing in the wind. Isla's heart skipped a beat as the woman turned slightly, revealing her face, eyes haunted, lips pressed together in a thin, hard line. Her face was familiar, but Isla couldn't place her immediately. It took a few moments before it hit her. Margaret. The tension between them seemed to crackle in the air as Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice low and steady. Margaret, what are you doing here? Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her gaze was fixed on the water, the reflection of the moon flickering across its dark surface. Her voice, when it came, was eerily calm, almost detached. I should have stopped it. I should have told someone. But I couldn't. I couldn't face what I knew. Her words were barely a whisper, but they felt like a confession. Isla stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. What do you mean? What did you know? Margaret finally turned to them, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had been crying for a long time. She took a deep, shuddering breath. I knew Carolyn was digging too deep. She was going to uncover something that no one was meant to know. Something that would ruin everything. She found it, you see. She found the truth. But she wasn't prepared for what that truth would cost her. Nathaniel stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. What truth? What did Carolyn find? Margaret's face twisted with guilt, and for the first time, Isla saw the cracks in her seemingly impenetrable exterior. It was about the town, about the people who ran it, the ones who controlled everything. There's a network, hidden in plain sight, of secrets, lies, and, she choked on her words, the people in power. They'll do anything to protect their secrets. Carolyn learned too much, and they silenced her. Isla's mind reeled as the weight of Margaret's confession settled on her shoulders. The town they had grown up in, the people they had trusted, had been hiding a dark truth all along. A truth that had cost Carolyn her life, and now, the remnants of that truth were spilling out like a dam finally breaking. Margaret continued, her voice trembling. Carolyn went to the river because she had a meeting there with someone who was going to help her expose it all. But she was too late. They knew she was coming. And that's when her voice faltered. They took her. They took her life. The silence that followed was suffocating. Isla felt the air around her grow heavy, as if the river itself were mourning the loss of the woman who had dared to seek the truth. Nathaniel's voice was quiet, but there was a sharp edge to it. Who are they, Margaret? Who killed Carolyn? Margaret's eyes flickered toward the water, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might break down completely. But instead she straightened, her expression hardening. I can't tell you their names, but I can tell you that they're watching you. They've been watching you ever since you stepped into this mess. The truth comes with a price, and you're both paying it now. Isla felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It was clear now. This wasn't just about the past. This was about the present. About the danger they were walking into by searching for the truth. The secrets they were uncovering weren't just buried. They were actively being protected, and anyone who threatened to expose them was a target. But even with that warning, Isla's resolve didn't waver. She knew that the truth, no matter how dangerous, was the only thing worth fighting for. Carolyn had paid the ultimate price for uncovering it, and Isla wasn't about to let that sacrifice be in vain. We'll expose it, Isla said, her voice steady and full of conviction. No matter what it takes, we'll make sure Caroline's death wasn't in vain. The people responsible for this, they won't get away with it. Margaret's eyes met hers, a flicker of something like respect passing through her gaze. You're a fool if you think you can take them down. But if you're determined, then there's one thing you need to know. She paused, then added in a low voice, they'll never stop coming for you. Once they know you're close to the truth, there's no going back. Isla nodded, feeling a sense of determination settle over her like a heavy cloak. Then we'll be ready. Nathaniel gave a sharp nod as well, his face hardening with resolve. We'll take them down. Together. Margaret turned toward the river once more, her expression distant, as if she were already resigned to the consequences of her own involvement. The truth is like a flame, you know. It burns brightly, and it exposes everything. But in the end, it leaves nothing but ashes. She glanced back at them, her voice quieter now. Be careful what you wish for. With that, Margaret turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Isla and Nathaniel standing alone on the riverbank. The quiet that followed felt deafening, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the truth they had uncovered hung in the air, like a heavy fog, and the path ahead seemed more uncertain than ever. That Isla felt a sense of clarity as well, recognition that there was no turning back, and no other choice. She had come this far, and no matter the cost, she was going to see it through. The truth had its price, but it was a price worth paying. The lives lost, the secrets kept, she would fight to make sure that everything came to light, no matter the consequences. And as she stood there, looking out at the dark waters, she realized something else. The truth was not just a weapon, it was a mirror. It forced people to confront the darkest parts of themselves, to reckon with the things they had done, and the choices they had made. In the end, it was the truth that would define them, not their secrets, not their sins. The moral of it all was simple. Asterisk, asterisk, the truth, no matter how painful, will always find its way to the surface. And when it does, it can either break you or set you free. Asterisk, asterisk. Isla chose freedom,